Huddled inside the shell of a ruined wagon, 29-year-old Claire Bennett clutched a threadbare shawl against a winter determined to be her grave. Up here, the gales whipping off the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot did not just blow, they hunted. When a massive silhouette materialized against the snow-blind horizon, she braced herself for the devil coming to collect. But it was Silas Kane. Offering no pity, he simply built a fire, damming the whispering town that had abandoned her to the cold. The cold was not a temperature anymore. It was a predator with teeth. Claire sat in the corner of the sod house, her knees pulled tight to her chest. The fire in the hearth had died 3 days ago, leaving only a pile of gray ash that looked like powdered bone. Her husband, Daniel, was buried somewhere outside, under 3 feet of snow. She could not remember where exactly. The storm had erased his grave the moment she finished dragging the frozen rocks over it. She was out of wood. She was out of food. She was out of tears. Her breath plumed in the dim light of the cabin, a weak, shallow rhythm. Her hands wrapped in strips of a torn blanket rested on her lap. They did not hurt anymore. That was the terrifying part. 2 days ago, her fingers burned, as if they had been held in an open flame. Now they were heavy, numb as wood. The town of Red Hollow was only 5 miles down the valley. 5 miles of waist-deep drifts. When Daniel had died of the fever, she had walked halfway there to beg for help. The Reverend had offered a prayer from his porch. The storekeeper had told her his ledger was too full to offer credit to a widow with a failed mining claim. The Lord provides for those who provide for themselves. Mrs. Bennett, they had said. Then they had closed their heavy oak doors against the wind. Claire leaned her head back against the frozen dirt wall. The freezing process, she realized, was profoundly lonely. Her eyelids fluttered. A strange, deceitful warmth began to bloom in her chest. The panic that had kept her awake for 72 hours was fading into a seductive lethargy. She closed her eyes. She imagined the summer heat of the Ohio valleys where she had grown up among maple and oak. She imagined Daniel smiling. The white sleep was taking her. Crunch, crunch. The sound was distant, muffled by the howling wind, but heavy, deliberate. Not a wolf. Not a mountain lion. The heavy plank door of the sod house did not open. It exploded inward. The leather hinges snapped in the freezing air as a man shouldered his way through the snowdrift, blocking the entrance. Claire's eyes dragged open. The doorway was filled with a hulking shape. A heavy bear-hide coat, a rifle held loosely in a gloved hand, a face obscured by a thick, ice-crusted beard, and the shadow of a wide-brimmed felt hat pulled low. Silas stepped inside. He had to duck to clear the doorframe. He stood in the center of the miserable room, his boots tracking in fresh powder. He did not say a word. His pale blue eyes scanned the dead hearth, the empty tin cupboards, and finally settled on the bundle of rags in the corner. Claire tried to speak. Her throat was paper dry. All that came out was a faint, scraping hiss. She tried to reach for the small iron skinning knife beside her boot, but her wooden fingers would not obey. Silas crossed the room in 2 strides. He smelled of wood smoke, raw earth, and old blood. He knelt. When he pulled his thick leather glove off with his teeth, his bare hand was rough, calloused, and shockingly warm. He pressed 2 fingers against the side of her neck, searching for the pulse beneath the frozen wool of her collar. "Heart's beating like a dying bird," he murmured. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, unused to conversation. He did not ask her name. He did not ask what happened. The situation explained itself. Silas stood up, unbuttoned his heavy bear-hide coat, and slipped it off his massive shoulders. He wrapped the enormous heavy pelt around Claire, engulfing her entirely. The sudden trap of his body heat lingering in the fur was a violent shock to her system. "Do not move," he said. It was not advice, it was a command. He moved efficiently. He kicked aside the broken chair Claire had been trying to chop up for firewood. He scooped his arms under her wrapped form. She weighed nothing to him, a bag of hollow bones. Where Claire managed to choke out. "Up," Silas said. He carried her out into the blinding white. The wind screamed, throwing icy needles against her face. Silas simply tucked her head against his chest, shielding her from the brunt of the gale. He did not head down the valley toward Red Hollow. He turned his back to the town and began to climb higher into the timberline, into the brutal, jagged moor of the mountains. Claire wanted to fight. She wanted to ask if he was taking her to die somewhere else. But the warmth of his chest beneath the wool and canvas of his clothes was the first real heat she had felt in weeks. She closed her eyes, surrendered to the sway of his heavy, trudging footsteps, and let the darkness take her again. She woke to the smell of burning pine and the sharp, metallic scent of rendering tallow. The heat was suffocating. It pressed against her face, a tangible weight. Claire gasped, her eyes flying open. She was staring at a ceiling of heavy, hand-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss. Lantern light flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across the rough timber. Then the pain hit. It started in her toes and ripped upward, a searing, excruciating agony, as though someone was driving hot nails directly into her bones. Claire let out a hoarse cry, her body arching off the narrow cot she was lying on. "Hold still." Silas was there. He sat on a low stool beside the bed. His bear-hide coat was gone, replaced by a simple faded red flannel shirt and heavy canvas trousers. His beard was thawed, framing a harsh, weathered face with deep lines etched around his eyes and mouth. This was a man who lived outside. He reached out and placed a heavy hand firmly on her shoulder, pinning her back against the mattress. "Blood's coming back," he said, his voice flat, devoid of bedside manner. "Frostbite. The thaw hurts worse than the freeze. You fight it, you will just exhaust yourself." Claire writhed beneath his grip, tears finally springing to her eyes. She had not cried when Daniel died. She had not cried when the fire went out. But the raw physical agony of returning to life broke the dam. She sobbed, her teeth chattering uncontrollably as a violent shiver overtook her. Silas did not shush her. He did not offer empty comforts. He simply held her shoulder down so she would not hurt herself. His gaze fixed on the roaring fire in the stone hearth a few feet away. He let her break down. He understood the necessity of it. When the worst of the agonizing spasms began to subside, leaving her gasping and slick with sweat, Silas released her. He turned to the small cast-iron stove and lifted a tin cup. "Drink," he ordered, holding it to her lips. Claire grimaced at the smell, bitter and earthy. "What is it?" she croaked. "Willow bark tea. Tastes like mud. Kills the pain. Drink it." She drank. It tasted exactly as he promised, but it coated her raw throat and settled warmly in her empty stomach. Silas set the cup down and pulled a thick wool blanket up to her chin. "You are in my cabin," he stated, 6 miles up from your claim. "Name's Silas." "Claire," she whispered. "Claire Bennett." "Your husband, dead of fever." Silas nodded once, a short, curt acknowledgement of the frontier's most common tragedy. He did not say he was sorry. He knew sorry did not put wood in the stove or meat on the table. For the next 3 days, Claire drifted in and out of a feverish sleep. The transition back to the living was grueling. Her feet and hands blistered terribly, wrapped in clean linen slathered in bear grease by Silas's surprisingly gentle hands. Through the haze, she watched him. He was a creature of profound routine. He woke before the sun. He checked his traps. He chopped wood. He skinned hides. He cooked simple, heavy meals: venison stew, oat mush, hardtack. He moved around the small cabin with a quiet grace that belied his massive frame, never bumping into the narrow table or knocking over the lanterns. They rarely spoke. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was practical. It was the silence of two people who understood that breath wasted on idle chatter was breath that could be used for surviving. On the fourth evening, the blisters on Claire's hands began to crack and heal. She could sit up on her own. She swung her legs over the edge of the cot, wincing as her feet touched the cold plank floor. Silas was sitting at the small table, carefully cleaning a heavy Sharps rifle with an oiled rag. "You should not have brought me here," Claire said. Her voice was stronger now, carrying the bitter edge of her grief. Silas did not look up from the rifle. "He would be dead by morning if I had not." Maybe that was the point. Silas stopped wiping the barrel. He set the rag down and looked at her. His pale eyes were piercing, stripping away her pride. "I have seen animals give up when their leg is in a trap," he said slowly. "They just lay their head in the snow and wait. You were not waiting. You had a knife in your hand when I walked in. You were too frozen to use it, but you had it ready." Claire looked down at her lap. He was right. Town abandoned you. Silas continued picking up the rag again. "I know Red Hollow. I know the people in it. They are quick to pray on a Sunday and quicker to lock their doors on a Monday. They saw a widow with no claim and no cash, and they decided you were a ghost before you even stopped breathing." "It is not proper," Claire muttered, clutching the blanket around her. "Me being here a widow, alone with a man unchaperoned?" Silas let out a short, harsh sound. It took Claire a moment to realize it was a laugh. It held absolutely no humor. "Proper," he repeated, tasting the word like it was spoiled meat. He stood up, towering over the table. "Proper gets you frozen solid in a dirt floor shack, Mrs. Bennett. Proper is a luxury for people who have enough firewood to stay warm while they judge their neighbors." He walked over to the hearth and threw another heavy log onto the grate. The sparks flew up the chimney in a bright, violent swarm. "You are alive," Silas said, his back to her. "That is all that matters on this mountain. You stay here until the spring thaw. Then you can go back down to your proper town, and they can properly pretend they did not leave you to die." Claire stared at his broad back. The cynicism in his voice mirrored the dark, hollow feeling in her own chest. She had played by the rules. She had been a good wife, a devout woman, and her reward had been a freezing death while the town slept soundly in their feather beds. "I do not know how to repay you," she said quietly. Silas turned. He looked at her, really looked at her hollow cheeks, her messy hair, her defensive posture. "Just heal," he said. By the second week, Claire was on her feet. Her toes were still tender, wrapped in thick wool socks Silas provided, but the frostbite had thankfully spared her digits. She needed to work. Idle hands brought the memories back. Daniel, coughing, the sound of the dirt hitting his shallow grave, so she integrated herself into Silas's silent rhythm. While he was out on the trap lines, she swept the cabin floor until the planks were smooth. She mended the tears in his flannel shirts with a needle and thread she found in a rusted tin. She kept the fire burning hot and even. When Silas returned at dusk, dusted in snow and carrying fresh game, he would pause at the door. He noticed the mended shirts folded on the foot of his bed. He noticed the smell of a stew already simmering on the stove. He never said thank you. He just nodded, hung up his coat, and ate 2 full bowls. It was a strange domesticity, born of pure, unadulterated pragmatism. But pragmatism requires supplies. The coffee tin was empty. The salt was running low. Silas needed powder and lead. "I am going down to Red Hollow," Silas announced one morning, strapping on his heavy leather snowshoes. "Be back by nightfall. Keep the door barred. Wolves are hungry this time of year." Claire stood by the stove, a sudden knot of anxiety tightening her stomach. Silas. He paused his hand on the heavy iron latch. "Do not tell them," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Do not tell them I am alive." Silas studied her face. He saw the shame and the stubborn pride warring in her eyes. He gave a single, slow nod, pulled his hat down low, and stepped out into the biting wind. Red Hollow was a muddy gash in the pristine snow of the valley. It was a town built on copper dreams and sustained by cheap whiskey and vicious gossip. Silas hated it. He hated the smell of unwashed bodies crammed into saloons, the clatter of wagons, the side-eyes from men who were too soft to survive a night in the timberline. He walked down the center of the main thoroughfare, a massive solitary force parting the sparse crowd. People stepped aside. Silas had a reputation. He was not a killer, but he was a man who preferred the company of grizzlies to humans, and that made him dangerous. He pushed through the doors of Crow's Mercantile. The bell above the door jingled sharply. Elias Crow, a thin man with a padded mustache and a calculating gaze, looked up from his ledger. His smile did not reach his eyes. "Silas, good to see you down from the peaks. Survived the cold snap, I see. Need salt. 50 pounds, 10 pounds of coffee, tin of black powder, lead." Silas slammed a heavy pouch of prime beaver pelts onto the counter. The furs were thick, glossy, and worth more than Crow would admit. Crow's eyes widened greedily. "Fine quality, Silas. I will get your provisions." While Crow scurried around the store, Silas walked down the narrow aisles. He picked up a sack of flour. Then his eyes landed on a shelf of women's goods. Combs, ribbons, small boots. Claire's boots had been cut off her swollen feet. She was wearing his spare wool socks around the cabin. Silas reached out and grabbed a pair of sturdy, fur-lined women's boots. He grabbed a bone hair comb. He tossed them onto the counter next to the salt. Crow returned with the coffee and powder. He stopped dead staring at the women's boots. His thin eyebrows arched up to his hairline. "Well now," Crow murmured, a greasy smirk playing on his lips. "Did not know you had company up there, Silas. You finally buy yourself a bride from back east." Silas said nothing. He stared Crow down, his eyes flat and cold. Crow, misreading the silence as an invitation to pry, leaned closer. "Only woman unaccounted for round here was that Bennett widow. Poor thing. Reverend Cole led a prayer for her last Sunday. Figured the wolves stripped her bones weeks ago after her husband passed." Crow looked at the boots again, his mind turning over the implications. His smirk vanished, replaced by a look of puritanical scandal. "Lord Almighty," Crow whispered. "You found her. You have got her up there." The store went silent. A few other patrons, overhearing the exchange, stopped browsing. The air grew thick with unspoken accusations. A widow woman, an older woman, by the fabric counter tutted loudly. "Alone under a bachelor's roof. It is a sin against God." "She is a ruined woman." "She should have come to the church," Crow said, recovering his righteous indignation. "We would have found a place for her in the poorhouse, living with a wild man in the woods. Disgraceful." Silas did not raise his voice. He did not reach for the heavy hunting knife on his belt. He just leaned forward, placing his massive hands flat on the wooden counter. The wood groaned under the pressure. He looked dead into Crow's eyes. "She knocked on your door 3 weeks ago, Crow. She begged you for a bag of oats and a cord of wood. You turned her away." Crow paled, taking a step back. "I run a business, Silas, not a charity. I could not." "I do not give a damn about your business," Silas interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous, vibrating bass. "You left her to freeze. You and the good reverend and every other hypocrite in this mud hole." He shoved the furs toward Crow. "Take out what I owe for the supplies. Keep the change." Silas gathered the heavy sacks effortlessly. He slung the salt over one shoulder, grabbed the flour, the powder, and tucked the women's boots under his arm. He stopped at the door and turned back to the silent, staring mercantile. He swept his cold gaze over all of them. She was freezing to death. Silas said the words, ringing out clear and harsh in the quiet room. "I have got room by the fire, and I do not care who talks." He kicked the door open and walked out into the falling snow, leaving the hypocrites to choke on their own gossip. When Silas returned to the cabin, long after dark, Claire was sitting by the fire. She looked up, the tension leaving her shoulders when she saw him bar the door behind him. He dropped the sacks on the table heavily. He reached into his coat and tossed the pair of fur-lined boots onto the cot beside her. Claire picked them up. The leather was soft, the fur thick and warm. She looked from the boots to Silas's back as he stoked the fire. "They know," Claire said softly. It was not a question. "Crow figured it out," Silas replied, not turning around. He drove the iron poker into the coals. "They assumed you were dead. Now they assume you are ruined." Claire closed her eyes. The weight of societal expectation, the invisible chains of propriety she had worn her entire life, suddenly felt suffocating. They had not cared if she died of exposure, but they cared deeply if she survived in the wrong company. She looked at the fire roaring in the hearth. She felt the heat on her skin. She looked at the giant of a man who had carried her through a blizzard and spent his hard-earned furs to buy her boots so she would not have to walk barefoot on cold planks. "Let them talk," Claire said. Silas stopped prodding the fire. He turned his head, looking over his shoulder at her. The firelight caught the edges of his beard, painting him in gold and shadow. Claire met his gaze, her chin lifting in a defiant, cynical acceptance of her new reality. "I am warm," she said, her voice steady. "Let them talk." Silas held her stare for a long moment. Then the corner of his mouth twitched upward just a fraction of an inch, a silent, shared rebellion. "Stew's getting cold," he said, turning back to the stove. January did not pass. It accumulated. It piled up against the small window pane in thick, opaque drifts, sealing the cabin in a twilight world of wood smoke and shadows. The silence between them evolved. It was no longer the heavy, awkward quiet of strangers. It became a shared language. Claire learned that a sharp clatter of firewood meant Silas had found less game than he wanted. Silas learned that when Claire oversalted the broth, her mind was wandering down the mountain back to the dirt-floor sod house and the frozen mound of earth beside it. Neither pointed these things out. They simply adjusted. Claire's hands healed, leaving the skin of her fingers slightly pink and perpetually tight, but capable. She took over the processing of the smaller hides, rabbits mostly. It was grisly, slick work. The first time Silas dropped 3 frozen hairs on the table and handed her the short skinning knife, she had hesitated. "Do not look at it as a carcass," Silas had said from the hearth, his back to her as he stoked the coals. "Look at it as tomorrow's supper and a lining for your mittens." Pity does not keep the draft out. She stripped the hides. She got blood under her fingernails. She scrubbed it out with coarse lye soap until her knuckles bled, only to do it again 2 days later. The frontier was stripping away the genteel Ohio woman piece by piece, leaving behind something harder, something forged. One afternoon, the wind died down to a dull, manageable moan. Claire watched Silas methodically cleaning his heavy Sharps buffalo rifle at the table. The smell of gun oil was sharp and metallic. "Show me how," Claire said. Silas paused. He looked at her, then down at the massive weapon. It weighed 12 pounds. It fired a bullet the size of a man's thumb. "It will break your shoulder, Claire. If a wolf breaks down that door while you are checking the upper trap line, a bruised shoulder will not matter much." Silas considered this. He did not argue with logic. He nodded, picked up the rifle, and walked to the heavy timber door. He unbarred it and kicked it open. The glare of the snowfield outside was blinding. He stepped out onto the packed snow of the porch. Claire followed, pulling the heavy bear-hide coat tightly around her frame. "Stance is everything," Silas said. He did not hand her the gun immediately. He positioned her. He tapped her left foot with his boot, nudging it forward. Lean into it. If you stand straight up, this gun will put you flat on your back in the snow. He handed her the sharps. Claire grunted. It was absurdly heavy, pulling her arms down. Silas stepped behind her. He did not hover delicately. He pressed his chest lightly against her back to brace her, reaching his large, calloused hands over hers to guide the barrel. The sudden, overwhelming heat of him through her coat made her breath hitch. He smelled of pine resin and old leather. "See the notch," he rumbled. His voice vibrated against her shoulder blades. "Put the front sight right in the center of it. Aim for that dead stump by the creek." Claire squinted. The metal was freezing against her bare cheek. "Breathe in," Silas instructed. "Let half of it out. Squeeze. Do not pull. Squeeze." Claire did. The roar of the sharps was deafening, a physical blow that rattled her teeth. The recoil slammed backward, brutal and unforgiving. Even with Silas bracing her, the impact knocked her a half step back, driving the steel butt plate deep into her shoulder. A spray of bark erupted from the dead stump 50 yards away. Claire lowered the smoking barrel. Her ears rang violently. Her shoulder throbbed with a sharp, blossoming ache. Silas stepped back. He looked at the stump, then down at her. "You flinched." "I hit it," she fired back, turning her head to glare at him, her eyes watering from the concussive blast. "You hit the edge." A charging catamount would not care about the edge, but there was a faint, unmistakable gleam of respect in his pale eyes. He took the rifle from her shaking hands. "Go inside. Put snow on that shoulder before it swells." That night, as Claire changed into her nightgown behind the canvas partitions Silas had rigged up, she looked at her shoulder in the small shaving mirror. A dark, ugly bruise, the exact shape of the rifle's butt plate, was blooming across her pale skin. She touched it. It hurt, but it was a clean pain, a pain with a purpose. It felt infinitely better than the numbness of the cold. The mountain demanded payment for the space they occupied. In late February, it came to collect. The storm had raged for 2 days, a blinding whiteout that shook the cabin down to its stone foundations. Silas had been forced to leave to check the short line. If the traps froze solid, they would lose the week's catch to scavengers. He had taken his snowshoes, his rifle, and a warning to Claire to keep the fire roaring. By nightfall, he had not returned. Claire sat by the stove. The wind screamed down the chimney, puffing wood smoke into the room. She kept a pot of water boiling. She paced. The cynical armor she had built over the last 2 months began to crack, letting the old, familiar terror seep in. Not again, she thought, staring at the heavy oak bar securing the door. I will not bury another man in the snow. At midnight, a heavy, dragging thump hit the front door. Claire froze. She grabbed the sharps, her bruised shoulder screaming in protest, and leveled it at the timber. Claire. The voice was a ragged gasp, barely audible over the wind. She dropped the rifle. She tore the heavy bar away and yanked the door open. Silas fell inside, bringing a collapsing snowdrift with him. He did not stand. He collapsed onto the floorboards, a massive, snow-covered heap. Claire slammed the door shut and dropped to her knees beside him. Silas. Silas. Look at me. He rolled onto his back. His face was the color of old parchment. His heavy canvas trousers were soaked, not with snow, with blood. It was a dark, terrifying crimson, freezing into stiff, blackish clumps against the fabric of his right leg. Boar, he grunted through clenched teeth. His eyes were wide, blown out with shock. Caught in a deadfall was not quite dead. Claire did not panic. Panic was a luxury for townfolk. She grabbed her skinning knife and dragged it up the seam of his heavy trousers, slicing the thick canvas open from the knee to the hip. The wound was ugly, a ragged, tearing gash 6 inches long and deep enough to show the gleam of white fascia beneath the muscle. The boar's tusk had missed the femoral artery by a fraction of an inch, but he was losing blood fast. "Belt," Claire ordered. Silas's hands were shaking too badly to work the buckle. Claire shoved his hands away. She unthreaded his thick leather belt, wrapped it high around his thigh, and pulled it tight. Silas let out a low, guttural groan, his head falling back against the floorboards. "I need to clean it," Claire said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. "It is going to hurt. Do it." She grabbed the boiling kettle from the stove and a clean rag. She did not hesitate. She poured the scalding water over the rag and pressed it directly into the open wound to flush the dirt and coarse boar hair out of the torn flesh. Silas's back arched off the floor. A raw, animalistic cry tore from his throat. His heavy hand reached out, grabbing Claire's wrist with bone-crushing force. He could have snapped it. Claire did not pull away. She leaned over him, her face inches from his, her eyes boring into his. "Hold on. Just hold on." He stared up at her chest, heaving, sweat cutting tracks through the grime on his face. He released her wrist, his hand falling heavily to the floor. "Sew it." She fetched her sewing tin. She did not have surgical silk. She had heavy linen thread used for mending canvas. She threaded the needle by the light of the flickering lantern. Her hands were perfectly steady. She did not know where the strength came from, only that if she broke now, the man who had carried her out of the white sleep would die on his own floor. She poured a splash of cheap whiskey over the needle, then over the wound. Silas gritted his teeth so hard Claire thought she heard one crack. She began to stitch. It was brutal work. The skin of a mountain man is thick-leathered by wind and sun. She had to force the steel needle through the flesh, pulling the ragged edges together with tight, unforgiving knots. For 30 minutes, the only sounds in the cabin were the howling wind outside, Silas's ragged, hissing breaths, and the wet slip of thread through skin. When she tied the final knot, she clipped the thread with her teeth. She wrapped the leg in clean, dry bandages, securing it tightly. Only then did she sit back on her heels. Her hands, covered in his drying blood, finally began to shake. Silas turned his head to look at her. His face was drawn, deeply lined with exhaustion and pain. He looked at the bloody needle in her trembling hand. He looked at the ruin of his trousers. "You did not faint," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. Claire wiped the back of her bloody hand across her forehead, leaving a dark smear against her pale skin. She looked down at him, her chest heaving. "You did not let me freeze," she replied. "I do not leave debts unpaid." Silas closed his eyes. The tension bled out of his massive frame, giving way to the heavy pull of exhaustion. "You are a hard woman, Claire Bennett." It was the highest compliment he knew how to give. Claire sat beside him on the floor, listening to the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart in his chest, until the storm outside finally began to break. It started as a single persistent sound. Drip. Claire stopped wiping down the rough timber table and listened. Drip. Drip. It was coming from the eaves of the cabin. The heavy icicles that had hung like fangs over the windows for 3 months were weeping. Outside, the harsh, biting chill of the wind had softened, carrying the distinct muddy scent of wet earth and pine needles. Spring was breaking the mountain's spine. Silas sat near the hearth. His leg was propped up on a stool. He walked with a heavy, agonizing limp, relying on a thick hickory branch as a cane, but the wound was closed and clean. He was whittling a piece of soft pine, the knife peeling off long, curling ribbons of wood. He did not look up at the sound of the dripping water, but Claire saw the tension tighten his jaw. Spring meant the passes were clear. Spring meant the heavy snows blocking the trail to Red Hollow would turn to navigable mud. Spring meant the isolation the forced, quiet world they had built together was ending. The silence in the cabin that afternoon was not comfortable. It was thick. It felt like the air before a thunderstorm. "Pass will be clear in a week," Silas said finally. He did not stop whittling. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. Claire carefully folded the rag in her hands. "I know. Crow runs a wagon down to Missoula, middle of April." Silas continued focusing intently on the piece of pine. "You could buy passage. Get out of this territory. Go back east where there are brick houses, chaperones." He was pushing her away. It was a clumsy, brutal attempt driven by the absolute certainty that he was unlovable, that he was nothing more than a rough beast fit only for the timberline. He was giving her the out before she could ask for it. Claire walked over to the hearth. She did not sit. She stood over him, casting a shadow across his work. "Is that what you want, Silas?" she asked. The knife stopped. Silas stared at the half-carved wood in his hands. He looked at the deep, healed scar on his thigh. He thought about the empty, hollow years in this cabin before he had kicked down her frozen door. The silence of the mountain had been his religion, but now the thought of returning to it felt like a death sentence. "It is what is proper," he lied, throwing her own word back at her. His voice was rough as bark. Claire scoffed. It was a harsh, bitter sound. Proper. She reached down and grabbed the piece of pine out of his hands, tossing it into the fire. Silas looked up, startled by the sudden violence of the movement. Claire met his pale eyes. There was no fear in her. The woman who had cowered in a freezing sod house was dead. In her place stood someone who knew the exact price of survival. "Proper left me to die," Claire said, her voice dropping to a low, intense register. "Proper assumes I am a ruined woman because I stayed alive by the grace of a mountain man. I do not give a damn about Red Hollow. I do not give a damn about Missoula." Silas stared at her. "You do not belong up here, Claire. It is brutal. It will break you." "You already tried to break me," she fired back, pointing at the heavy Sharps rifle in the corner. "The mountain tried to break you. Who sewed you back together?" Silas had no answer. He looked at her flushed face, the fierce, defiant set of her jaw, and the pink healing scars on her knuckles. She was not fragile. She was iron. Claire took a step closer, closing the distance between them. She reached out and placed her hand over his. His hand was massive, scarred and rough. Hers was small, but the grip was unyielding. "I am not leaving," Claire said. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact. "Unless you throw me out." Silas looked down at their joined hands. The contrast was stark, yet they fit together like a mortise and tenon, two hard things locking to form something unbreakable. He slowly turned his hand over, his thick fingers wrapping around hers, engulfing her hand in heat. He looked up into her eyes. The cynical armor he wore finally cracked, revealing the raw, profound relief beneath it. "I do not have a deed to this land," Silas warned her, his voice barely a rumble in his chest. "I do not have money in a bank, just furs and a long winter." "I do not need a bank," Claire said softly, her thumb tracing the heavy calluses on his knuckles. "I have got room by the fire." Silas pulled her down. It was not a gentle, sweeping romance novel kiss. It was desperate. It was rough. It tasted of wood smoke and coffee and survival. He wrapped his massive arms around her, pulling her against his chest as if the winter wind were about to rip her away. Claire anchored her hands in his thick, unkempt hair, holding on just as fiercely. Outside, the ice finally broke off the eaves, shattering on the ground below. The mountain was thawing, and they did not care who in the valley below was talking about it. Spring on the Bitterroot was not a gentle awakening. It was a violent, muddy exhumation. The snow did not just melt. It bled into the soil, turning the mountain trails into sucking, treacherous bogs. The pristine white blanket that had hidden the harsh realities of the landscape peeled back, revealing the rotting carcasses of winter-killed elk, shattered pine boughs, and miles of dark, saturated earth. The creeks roared, swollen and angry, tearing at their banks with brown, foaming water. Claire stood on the porch of the cabin, the heavy bear-hide coat replaced by a canvas jacket she had tailored to fit her own frame. She watched Silas load the pack mules. He moved with a slight, permanent hitch in his step. The boar's tusk had left a thick, knotted scar that pulled in the damp weather, but his strength was undiminished. They had spent the last 2 weeks pressing and bundling the winter's catch: beaver, fox marten, and the thick, silver-tipped grizzly pelt Silas had taken in late November. It was a fortune in fur, more than enough to buy passage out of the territory, more than enough to build a comfortable life somewhere soft. Neither of them had mentioned leaving since the day the eaves began to drip. "Cinch is loose on the near one," Claire called out. Silas paused, running a hand over the mule's belly. He grunted, pulling the leather strap tight. The mule pinned its ears back and snapped its teeth. Silas merely swatted its nose with the back of his hand, a casual reprimand. "Takes a sharp eye to catch that," from the porch, he noted, not looking back. "Takes a sharp eye to survive up here," she replied. She walked down the steps, her fur-lined boots sinking an inch into the muck. She did not carry a parasol or a reticule. She carried the heavy Sharps rifle, resting the barrel comfortably over her shoulder. The bruise on her collarbone had faded to a pale yellow weeks ago, replaced by a dense pad of muscle accustomed to the weapon's weight. Silas finished tying the last bundle. He turned and looked at her. He took in the canvas jacket, the braided hair tucked under a wide-brimmed felt hat, the rifle, and the steady, unflinching gaze. She belonged to the timberline now. "We leave in 10, Silas said. The journey down to Red Hollow was brutal. The mud clung to the mule's hooves in heavy clumps. They walked in silence, listening to the creak of the leather and the slosh of the trail. The higher they had been, the cleaner the air. As they descended into the valley, the scent of pine and fresh water was slowly replaced by the acrid smell of coal smoke, raw sewage, and unwashed humanity. Claire felt a knot tighten in her stomach. It was not fear, it was disgust. She remembered the last time she had walked this valley. She had been half dead, stumbling through waist-deep drifts, begging a closed door for a handful of oats. She remembered the faces of the people who had looked right through her. Silas stopped his horse. He looked back at her. He did not ask if she was all right. He knew she was, but he also knew the ghosts she was riding toward. "You do not have to look at them," Silas said, his voice a low rumble over the sound of the swollen creek beside them. "You do not owe them a damn explanation." "I know," Claire said. She adjusted her grip on the reins. "But they are going to look at me. I intend to let them." Silas nodded once. He turned his horse forward and spurred it into a slow walk. They broke through the tree line just after midday. Red Hollow sat in the basin like a stain. The main street was a river of churned-up mud, crisscrossed with deep wagon ruts. Men in dirty canvas and slouch hats milled about the boardwalks. When Silas rode into town, the noise usually dipped. When Silas rode into town leading 3 heavily laden pack mules, the noise stopped. When they saw the woman riding beside him, sitting tall in the saddle with a buffalo rifle resting across her lap, the silence turned absolute. Claire kept her chin level. She felt the weight of their stares. She saw the women whispering behind gloved hands through the dusty windows of the boarding house. She saw the miners lean against the saloon posts, their eyes tracing her from the muddy boots to the brim of her hat. They expected a ghost. They expected a ruined, broken thing cowering behind the wild man of the mountain. Instead, Claire looked right back at them. Her gaze was as flat and cold as the winter they had abandoned her to. One by one, the townsfolk looked away, suddenly finding the mud at their boots incredibly interesting. The shame they should have felt 3 months ago finally began to curdle in their guts. Silas led them straight to Crow's mercantile. He dismounted, tying his horse to the hitching post. He did not offer a hand to Claire. She did not need it. She swung down from the saddle, boots hitting the boardwalk with a heavy, wet thud. "Let us get this done," Silas muttered. The bell above the mercantile door jingled, a cheerful, entirely out-of-place sound. The store was crowded. The spring thaw always brought the miners and trappers in for supplies. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool, stale tobacco, and kerosene. Elias Crow stood behind the long wooden counter. He was mid-sentence laughing with a man in a black broadcloth suit. The laugh died in his throat. The crowd parted. It was not a polite shuffling aside. It was a rapid, nervous retreat. Silas walked through the empty space like a boulder rolling downhill, Claire matching him stride for stride. Crow swallowed hard. His eyes darted from Silas's massive frame to Claire. "Silas, Mrs. Bennett, I see the spring has brought you down." "Bring the scales, Crow," Silas said. He did not offer a greeting. He simply unslung the first massive bundle of furs from his shoulder and dropped it onto the counter. The heavy wood groaned under the weight. Crow scurried to fetch his weights. The man in the black broadcloth suit did not move away. He was Amos Drake, the town assayer, and the man who held the paper on half the failed claims in Red Hollow. He was thick-waisted, with a red, veiny nose, and eyes that calculated the value of everything they touched. Amos tipped his hat, a slick, greasy gesture. "Mrs. Bennett, it is a profound miracle to see you breathing. The whole town assumed you perished with poor Daniel." Claire looked at Amos. She knew him. He had been the one to sell Daniel the claim, fully aware the vein was tapped out. "It was not a miracle, Mr. Drake," Claire said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent store. "It was a cord of wood and a man willing to chop it." Amos offered a patronizing smile. "Indeed, though the circumstances of your salvation are quite the topic of discussion. A widow residing in a bachelor's cabin. The Reverend Cole was just speaking on the moral decay of the frontier last Sunday." At the mention of his name, Reverend Cole pushed his way to the front of the crowd. He was a tall, severe man with a collar that looked too tight for his neck. Claire, the Reverend, said, his tone dripping with practiced sorrow, "The Lord tests us, but we must not fall into sin for the sake of survival. The church is prepared to offer you sanctuary. We can write to your family in Ohio. We can help you wash away this stain." Silas went still. His hand rested inches from the heavy hunting knife on his belt. The air in the mercantile suddenly felt dangerously thin. He did not look at the Reverend. He looked at Claire, waiting. This was her fight. He would finish it if she asked, but he knew she did not want him to. Claire turned to face Reverend Cole. She did not look angry. She looked tired, the kind of bone-deep fatigue that comes from dealing with fools. "Sanctuary," Claire repeated. The word tasted foul. "Where was your sanctuary in January, Reverend?" "When I walked 3 miles in a blizzard to your church and asked for flour, you gave me a psalm. I could not bake a psalm. I could not burn it to stay warm." The Reverend flushed, drawing himself up. "The church's resources are for the pious. The church's resources are for the comfortable." Claire cut him off, her voice cracking like a bullwhip. "Do not you dare stand there in your warm wool coat and preach to me about stains. The only stain on me is the mud from this miserable town." She turned back to the counter, ignoring the sputtering Reverend. She reached inside her canvas jacket and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. She tossed it onto the counter right in front of Amos Drake. It hit the wood with a heavy, clinking sound. "What is this?" Amos asked, eyeing the pouch. "That is $20 in gold dust," Claire said. It clears the remaining debt on Daniel's claim. The assayer's office holds the deed. You will transfer it to my name." Amos looked taken aback. "Mrs. Bennett, you cannot possibly work that claim. It is dead rock." "It is my rock," Claire said flatly, "and it borders the timberline. It is the only clear path up to Silas's trapping grounds." "You will not be sending any more of your desperate greenhorn miners up that ridge to freeze. The ridge is closed." Crow stopped weighing the furs, his jaw slack. Amos stared at the pouch, then up at Claire. He looked at Silas, who was leaning casually against the counter, his pale eyes tracking every movement in the room. "I do not think you have the authority," Amos started. "She has the gold," Silas interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, shaking the dust off the shelves. "And she has the paper. Transfer the damn deed, Drake." Amos swallowed heavily. He snatched the pouch, untied the strings, and inspected the dust. "Fine. If you want to waste your money on dead dirt, it is yours." Claire watched him write the receipt. She did not feel a rush of victory. She felt a profound, settling calm. She was erasing the last tie she had to the victim they thought she was. Crow finished tallying the furs. He pushed a thick stack of greenbacks across the counter. "It is a legendary catch, Silas. Best prime beaver I have seen in 5 years. You want the rest in coin or credit?" "Flour, coffee, sugar, 2 cases of rifle cartridges, needles, heavy canvas." Silas listed off rapidly. "And a crate of peaches," Claire added. Silas looked at her, an eyebrow raised. Peaches in syrup were a staggering luxury. They cost their weight in silver. "Peaches," Silas confirmed, turning back to Crow. 2 crates. While Crow and his boy loaded the supplies onto the mules, Claire and Silas stood on the boardwalk. The townsfolk gave them a wide berth. The whispering had stopped. Now there was only a wary, respectful silence. Reverend Cole stood in the doorway of the mercantile watching them. "You are walking away from civilization, Claire. You are walking into the wild. God does not look under the pine trees." Claire stepped up to her own mule. She took the reins in her hand. She looked back at the Reverend, her expression entirely unreadable. "If God is in this town," Reverend Claire said, "I would rather take my chances with the wolves." She swung up into the saddle. Silas mounted his horse beside her. He did not say a word to the town. He just clicked his tongue, and the small caravan turned its back on Red Hollow, heading straight back toward the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Bitterroot. The ride up the mountain was a slow, grueling ascent that punished the mules and tested the riders. But with every 100 feet of elevation gained, the tension slowly bled out of Claire's shoulders. Down in the valley, the world was composed of sucking mud, calculating eyes, and the suffocating weight of whispered judgments. Up here, the earth was honest. The muddy tracks gradually gave way to firm, damp soil, and then to a resilient, quiet carpet of fallen pine needles. The air grew sharp. It bit at her cheeks and lungs, scrubbing away the lingering stench of coal smoke, cheap whiskey, and Reverend Cole's practiced piety. Claire rode behind Silas, watching the broad expanse of his back sway with the rhythm of his horse. He did not look back. He did not need to. He navigated the treacherous rocky switchbacks with the unconscious ease of a man walking his own hallway. By the time they reached the high clearing, the sun had already slipped behind the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Bitterroot. The sky bruised into violent streaks of purple deep indigo and fading gold. The shadows stretched long and cold across the packed earth, and there sat the cabin. It was not a grand estate. It was a brutalist structure of necessity, built from hand-hewn logs and chinked with hardened mud. The roof was heavy with lingering snowpack. The wind still whistled through the timber joints if it blew hard enough from the north. But as Claire swung her aching legs over the saddle and dropped to the ground, her fur-lined boots hitting the frozen dirt with a heavy thud, she knew she would not trade this rough-hewn box for a mansion in Cincinnati. They worked in tandem. It was a well-oiled machine of shared, silent labor. Silas unloaded the heavy sacks of flour, the coffee beans and the ammunition carrying them, inside with his permanent heavy limp. Claire unburdened the mules, brushing the sweat and dried mud from their flanks in the lean-to, before pitching them fresh hay. When she finally walked through the heavy timber door, the cabin was no longer a cold, dark shell. Silas had already struck a match. The fire was roaring in the stone hearth, the dry pine snapping violently and throwing long, dancing shadows across the rough floorboards. The sudden rush of heat hit Claire's face, a tangible, physical welcome. She took off her wide-brimmed hat, hung her heavy canvas coat on the rusted iron peg by the door, and let out a long, ragged breath. Silas stood by the small wooden table. He had taken a crowbar to one of the newly purchased crates. He reached inside and pulled out a heavy tin, peaches. He did not bother searching for bowls. He drew the heavy hunting knife from his belt, the blade still bearing the faint polished scratches of 100 skinned hides. He stabbed the tip through the thick lid of the tin, wrenching it around in a jagged circle with a harsh metallic squeal. He pulled the lid back, grabbed 2 spoons from an empty coffee cup, and handed one to Claire. She walked to the table. She looked down at the bright golden fruit suspended in thick sugary syrup. It was an absurd sight in a trapper's cabin. It was an extravagant, reckless luxury purchased with the blood of a winter's hunt. Claire took a scoop. The sweetness was a physical shock. It tasted of a summer she had not seen. A burst of pure, unadulterated pleasure right in the center of the mountain chill. She closed her eyes for a second, savoring the heavy syrup coating her tongue. Silas simply leaned over the table, digging his spoon into the tin. He ate like he did everything else, efficiently, quietly, and with intense focus. "Good?" he asked. It was a rare, entirely unnecessary question. "Better than good," Claire said. They stood there in the flickering lantern light, eating straight from the jagged metal tin. The silence between them was profound. It was not the uncomfortable quiet of strangers, nor the heavy silence of the town. It was the absolute, comfortable stillness of 2 people who had nothing left to hide. When the tin was scraped empty, Silas tossed it into the scrap bucket by the door. It landed with a hollow clatter. He walked over to the hearth, picked up the heavy iron poker, and shifted a burning log. A shower of bright orange sparks flew up the blackened chimney. Claire watched him. She studied the way the firelight caught the gray threading through his unkempt beard. She watched the permanent slump of his right shoulder from years of carrying a 12-pound rifle. She looked at the way he favored his scarred leg. He was not a hero from a dime novel. He was a difficult, solitary, and largely silent creature of the timberline. But he had never let her fire go out. Claire crossed the room. She stood beside him on the stone hearth, staring into the heart of the flames. "You did not have to back me down there," she said quietly, her voice barely rising above the crackle of the burning pine. "With Amos Drake, with the Reverend, you could have stayed out of it." Silas did not look away from the fire. He leaned heavily on the iron poker, his knuckles white. "Was not my fight. You had the gold. You had the words. I just provided the shadow." Claire turned her head to look at his profile. "They think I am a harlot, Silas." She said the word plainly. She stripped it of its venom, letting it fall flat and powerless onto the floorboards between them. "Townfolk think a lot of things," Silas replied, his voice a low, steady rumble that vibrated in his chest. "Mostly because they do not have enough real bone-breaking work to keep their minds occupied. Their thoughts do not survive past the timberline. The wind strips them away." He finally turned his head to look at her. His pale blue eyes were intense, pinning her in place. "You own that ridge now." He pointed out a faint trace of something that might have been amusement touching the corner of his mouth. "Means I am running my trap lines on your property." Claire let out a small huffing laugh, the sound sharp and clear in the quiet room. I suppose you are. We will have to discuss a lease. I charge a steep toll. Silas did not smile, but the hard-weathered lines around his eyes softened entirely. He reached out. His massive, calloused hand moved with a shocking, deliberate gentleness. He tucked a stray strand of braided hair behind her ear, his rough fingertips lingering for a fraction of a second against the warm skin of her jawbone. I do not hold with paper, Claire, Silas said softly. It was the most vulnerable, unguarded tone she had ever heard him use. I do not hold with preachers or rings or the laws they make in mudhole towns. The mountain takes back everything you try to claim with a signature. He let his hand drop, resting it heavily on her shoulder. The weight of his palm was anchoring. It felt like gravity. But I hold with what I can defend, he continued, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. I hold with what I can keep warm. Claire looked up at him. She understood the weight of the words. He was offering her the only kind of vow a man forged in ice and isolation could make. He was not promising her wealth or social standing or a gentle life. He was offering an absolute, unbreakable permanence. He was offering to stand between her and the winter, between her and the world, until the day he stopped breathing. She stepped into him. She did not hesitate. Claire wrapped her arms around his thick waist, resting her face against the heavy, wood-scented flannel of his chest. She pressed her ear to him, listening to the slow, deep, rhythmic drumbeat of his heart. Then keep me warm, Claire whispered into the fabric of his shirt. Silas's massive arms wrapped around her, pulling her tight against his chest. He rested his chin carefully on the top of her head, entirely engulfing her in his heat. Outside the thick walls of the cabin, the spring wind began to howl, a low, vicious reminder of the harsh world waiting just beyond the heavy timber door. But inside, the fire burned hot, bright, and steady. They stood there in the center of the room, two hardened survivors who had clawed their way out of the freezing dark, staking their final, unyielding claim, not on the dirt, or the gold, or the approval of a town, but entirely on each other. If Silas and Claire's fight for survival and love against the bitter cold and a judging town kept you hooked, do not let the fire go out here. The frontier is full of untold stories of grit, resilience, and unapologetic romance. Hit that like button if you respect Claire's iron. Share this tale with someone who loves an authentic Western drama, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more deeply human, grounded storytelling. Drop a comment below. Would you have faced down the town or stayed on the mountain? See you on the next one.